Okay, my friends, there was one section in preparation for our assessment on Friday that I wanted to make sure I spent a little bit more time going through. We went through it once already, but this was, I kept getting a couple of different questions about the hormone piece, and I wanted to make sure you were comfortable with that section. And particularly, we're dealing with the female hormones, because the guys are pretty straightforward. But I do need your attention. This would be beginning, thanks for having this ready for me, would be beginning around, there we go, talking about page 534 and moving on through 537, dealing with hormones and the cycle. So I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes. It's not going to be a huge piece. The hormones are secreted by the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary, and those then influence the ovaries, right? Which those are what produce the actual female hormones there. So again, about 10 years of age, the hypothalamus starts secreting more of the hormone that controls the gonadotropin-releasing hormone that controls the anterior pituitary to produce the luteinizing hormone and the follicle-stimulating hormone. And these two play a key role, luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone. So, at puberty now, so that happens about age 10, and now we're into about puberty, which is a very wide range, but you're talking about anywhere from 11 to 12 all the way into 16 or 17. Just depends on the person. The ovaries now will start making estrogen in response to that follicle-stimulating hormone. And the estrogen is responsible for the female secondary sex characteristics. So, stuff like the breast development, the increase of adipose tissue. You realize that women actually have a layer of adipose tissue, of fat, that men don't. That's what makes their skin so soft. You with me? Sure. Absolutely. No, absolutely. There's more of it there. Yes. It's okay. Sorry. As well as increased vascularization, more blood flow to the skin. Shh. Stay with me. Stay with me. It also deals with the amount of testosterone present. So now the testosterone also helps with that. So increasing testosterone makes it easier for muscles to be built. Yes. It is. I hear you. I hear you. Moving on quickly. Progesterone. Progesterone is the other main hormone that's secreted by the ovaries, and that is what triggers the uterus changes during the menstrual cycle. We'll talk more about that in a second. Okay? So that cycle is what they call menarche, right? Your period. That's the actual name of it, the menarche. And this is, sorry? You may hear it used as that individual first one, but it really is that monthly cycle. This is the actual name for it. So let's talk about what's happening, because your period is basically focused on the uterus, right? How these hormones change the uterus. Did I answer your question? Or?
So what's menses?
That actual blood flow. Yeah, but this is talking about that whole monthly changing of the cycle. Okay? So the cycle is started by the follicle-stimulating hormone, which stimulates the maturation of a follicle in the ovary. So if I slide down here, follicle-stimulating hormone, which starts the maturation of the follicle. So again, over the course of this time, follicle-stimulating hormone stimulates the follicle. Does that make sense? The name tells you what it does. The follicle is the actual, think of it like the seed that grows into the egg. Okay? So you'll see that when it matures, the egg comes out of it, right? That's what ovulation is. The ovum being released, the egg being released. but the follicle actually then stays and decays into these other pieces. Does that make sense? So you have it's like the place where the egg is grown is what the follicle is. It's growing, it's maturing. The egg is released, its own separate something. That follicle then shrivels up into the luteal phase, right? The corpus luteum and then the corpus albicans. That these guys are still producing hormones. They still play a role, but they're not the actual egg. Does that make sense? So the follicle is stimulating by that follicle-stimulating hormone. The follicle egg surrounding, this is what I just said, but we'll read through here. The follicular cells surrounding the developing oocyte, the developing egg, they secrete estrogen. So these guys here are what are secreting the estrogen. And you notice as that maturation occurs, more and more estrogen, the red line, is produced. Does that make sense? As the follicle is growing, as it's maturing, it's producing more and more estrogen. Which again, that's responsible for maintaining these secondary sexual characteristics as well as a thickening of the uterine lining. Because notice, as this starts to increase, so does the lining of that endometrium. That's what this last little piece here is showing you. Ovulation is triggered by a mid-cycle surge in luteinizing hormone. So right here, this yellow piece up on top, notice it's going along at a fairly level state, and then suddenly, boom, huge bump in that luteinizing hormone. And what that's doing is saying to the follicle, hey, we're ready, let's go, release that egg. And so that's when ovulation occurs. Remember I mentioned that there are tests, urine tests, that you can just get to use at home that will measure the level of this luteinizing hormone. Why would that be important? Who would care about that? Someone who? Who would care about when that spike happens of luteinizing hormone? Somebody who wants to get pregnant, right? Because we know that there's a normal level of luteinizing hormone until there's this big spike. What happens at that big spike? You ovulate. The egg is released. And so again, if you are trying to have kids, this is the ideal time to have sex within that couple-day window. Because you have the best chance of those sperm finding that egg and meeting.
The egg is like fertilized in like a different time period, not like during ovulation. Could it have like birth defects and stuff? Or is it just like...
So you can't actually the sperm cannot get to an egg other than at ovulation. They're contained inside that follicle. The sperm cannot access them. Does that make sense? So the only time you can get pregnant is when that egg has been released, in that 3 to 4 days it takes for the egg to travel out. Following ovulation, then the follicular cells turn into the corpus luteum that continues to secrete amounts of estrogen and progesterone. So the point being is that once ovulation occurs, these guys don't stop working, right? You see that this big progesterone, that's the green graph, continues to increase even more after ovulation. And again, that comes from that corpus luteum. Does that make sense? This is all in that 1 month time frame. You got it. Yep. And then once you finish that basic 28-day stage, the follicle is now decayed into this little thing called the corpus albicans. And that just basically means that follicle is done. It's done its work. It's gone through its monthly cycle. It's finished. And now the next month, a new follicle goes through the same process. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, just to be clear,
Mm-hmm.
so the elevation at this age is two hormones that kind of start the process.
Right?
Okay, so then,
Because they're both causing the follicle to mature.
oh, okay, so if that happens and the follicle matures, like that's like happens, and then what is estrogen and progesterone?
These guys are both playing a role in getting the uterus ready. That's their key role. Because again, you can see, especially progesterone, the green mirrors very closely the uterus, like the depth. Those two graphs look very similar. Their shape very similar. So yeah, estrogen and progesterone are certainly working mostly on the uterus there.
Doesn't it start with the hormone in the hypothalamus and then it goes to the ovary?
Right. Because remember, that's the one that hypothalamus controls the pituitary gland working.
And then that stimulates the ovaries to produce.
Estrogen and progesterone. Yeah, absolutely. So you've got, these are actually pituitary gland hormones, right, that are being released, that are controlling the follicles, which are then producing the estrogen and progesterone. Absolutely. Good point. Does that make sense, my friends? And I am telling you, you will see a question about this on Friday. I want you to be able to talk me through how these hormones play a role in this cycle. When they happen, what they affect. Sir?
Like, what actually is a hormone? Like, I know what it does. It stimulates things that happen. But physically, what is it?
It's a protein. Yeah, it's a protein that just has a very specific function. Its function is to have certain target cells that it works on, and it causes them to do some sort of other function.
Okay, so it's not like a nerve telling something what to do. It's like a physical
Right. Exactly. Remember, nerves, you have to actually have connections between. If I want to tell Paige to do something, I have to actually have a connection that goes from me to Paige to say, hey, Paige, do this, right? Whereas a hormone, I can just, as the hormone-producing cell, I can produce that hormone, and it can flow on the bloodstream and get back to Paige, and she can still do what needs to happen.
And it only affects certain cells.
The target cells. Exactly. Right. It'll go right past Mikey. He doesn't care about it. He just keeps moving. Does that make sense? Yeah. And again, that's that key piece of the endocrine system. The blood is flooded with hormones, but it only affects certain cells.
So how many hormones are affected with this? Just progesterone?
Right. We are limiting ourselves to these four. There's plenty of others that play roles, but these four are what we're dealing with here.
Sorry. The FSH is secreted and acts like ovaries to stimulate maturing of the follicles. And the FSH also causes production of estrogen. And there's also a surge of the luteinizing hormone that causes ovulation.
Right. It doesn't cause luteinizing hormone to surge, because these are both from the pituitary gland. These guys then affect the amount of estrogen and progesterone being produced. Right. Luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone. It does stimulate these guys. Yes. Think of it this way, guys. Are you comfortable that after ovulation, the follicle is called the luteal phase? Are y'all with me? After ovulation, the follicle, that phase is called the luteal phase, right? It's the corpus luteum. Luteinizing hormone is basically trying to get the follicle to get to that corpus luteum. It wants to make it into it's lutealizing it. Undergoing corpus? I don't know.
Yeah, it's a stage, right? Isn't it a stage?
The corpus luteum is the name for the follicle once the egg has been released. Yeah, so it basically is changing from this follicle into the corpus luteum. That's just basically the shell once the egg has been released. Because that shell is still producing progesterone and estrogen. Are we cool? Good. All right. So I'm going to stop this here.